I want to talk about why I am talking about Napoleon Sanhedrin, the history and halachos of Jewish censorship. Why is this a topic that we should be talking about now? I actually think this is an incredibly important and, believe it or not, relevant to this very day. We do not have Napoleon anymore, and we do not yet have a Sanhedrin. Why did I choose this topic? So first and foremost, I am very interested in the world of censorship, as we will explore. You could imagine yourself, if you go into a party, it is my waking nightmare. You walk into a party and you realize that your friends from your hometown and your friends from where you moved and your friends from camp and your friends from growing up, they are all together at the same party. Now, for some of you, the extroverts in the room, that is an absolute joy. This is so exciting. We're all here together. If you are an introvert and all of your different circles of friends converge on one another, that is a waking nightmare. Why is it a waking nightmare? Because they all know you from different aspects of life. I know you from when you were a little kid. I know you from reading your articles. We work together, professionals. And when everybody comes together, you feel all of a sudden, I want to be the right person in front of everybody. And what do very often people do? I know I do this myself. We self-censor. There are things that we don't want to discuss, we don't want to talk about. And as you will see and as we will explore, the role of censorship is much more than just a top-down guide coming down and saying, you have to take this out, don't say this. Censorship is actually what forms, in my belief, the very nature of Torah learning itself, and I believe some aspects of censorship are downright messianic in their ability to formulate an idea of Torah for the modern age. There is a famous story, it's probably not true, about somebody who is so curious about the laws of Shabbos. He does not understand why the Jewish people keep Shabbos the way they do. And he goes up to one of his Jewish friends. He says, I don't understand it. One day a week, I notice all you Jews, you don't turn on lights. None of you're not driving in cars. You abstain from electricity. What is it that you do? He says, the only way to explain Shabbos is you need to experience it. So he says, okay, I'll shadow you for one Shabbos. And he comes in to shadow him for a Shabbos. And on Friday night, they have this beautiful davening, and they're singing, and it's really majestic. And then they come home, and they have the meal. They have a couple of chaims, and it's beautiful. They have a little bit of schnapps. And then the next morning, they wake up a little bit woozy. And then again, a little bit more davening, very beautiful. And then there's a kiddush after davening, more l'chaims. And then they have the meal, a couple more, a little bit more schnapps. And he goes through the whole Shabbos. And he says, so now you get it. Now do you understand what Shabbos is? He's like, I'm going to be honest with you. I still have no idea why you can't turn on lights on Shabbos, but I absolutely understand why you can't drive. I get that. Totally get it. What does this story tell you? The story tells you that we have an inherent experience called Shabbos, and then when we transmit it to somebody who doesn't understand what the inherent experience is, we need to then take that experience and find the language in order to transmit what this is all about. And this can sometimes be very wonderful and very uplifting when a friend asks you, I'm sure there are so many great rabbis and scholars at this Shabbos, they're dying for somebody to come over to them and ask them, what's the reason behind this Jewish law? Why do we do this? But sometimes you get asked that question, and this happens more and more online now, when somebody asks you something about Jewish life, and then you start to get a little bit worried. You say, what are you going to do with this information? What are the words that I tell you to explain why Jewish life is the way it is? What are you going to do with that? In 1806, and then finally convened in 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was the great revolutionary of the French Republic. He wanted to bring democracy and build empires. He wasn't into freedom per se. He liked freedom in order to build empires. He wanted to really be like Caesar, like the great leaders who had empires that were spanning countries and continents. Napoleon, in a sense, wanted to take over the world. And it's so interesting that this is true over and over again throughout world history. When you want to take over the world, you realize the one group of people who have the secrets of identity and self-preservation are the Jewish people. So Napoleon said, if I'm going to build this empire, I'm going to grant equal citizen rights to the Jews. Why would he want to grant equal citizen rights to the Jews? Napoleon was a nice guy. He wasn't necessarily a lover of the Jewish people. Though, this is important to know, Napoleon was really the first person to submit the idea that the Jewish people should be able to restore their homeland. He almost actually developed and sent out, it was never sent to law, something similar to the Balfour Declaration, where Napoleon wanted the Jewish people to come back to Israel. You could have your homeland, but it will be a part of the French Napoleon Empire. That never happened, but he did grant equal citizen rights to the Jewish people. And while he was doing that, he realized that before we take this group of people who were known throughout history, who were preserving their identity throughout history, something that was very enchanting for the French nationalism, that sense of pride in who we are, that sense of excitement that we have an identity, we have a purpose. He wanted to learn that from the Jewish people. There is a famous apocryphal story. It is not entirely true, but it really relates to the mission of what Napoleon was doing, and I'll tell it now because it relates to the very time that we were in. There is a story, and this story goes back, it's probably been told for over 100 years, probably 150 years. It cropped up in the mid-1800s, where Napoleon on Tisha B'Av was walking by a synagogue, and he peeked into the synagogue, and he said, "What on earth is going on in here? What are all the Jews doing?" And he said, we're mourning for the destruction of our temple. And Napoleon was shocked, as the story goes. He says, how can it be the temple was, which temple? The one that was destroyed in 78? That's almost 2,000 years ago. You're still mourning for this? And Napoleon looked at the Jewish people and said, if you are able to keep that sense of identity so alive and be able to mourn after 2,000 years for a destroyed temple, that I know for certain is the very same power that's going to allow for it to be rebuilt. So this is probably not a true story, but what is true is that Napoleon was enchanted by the notion of a Jewish empire. He was enchanted by the idea of a people who preserves their identity throughout history. And he did something absolutely wild. He sent out letters to the major rabbis across Europe and gathered together, and he said, I want to regather and reconvene, and he used these words, a Sanhedrin. A Sanhedrin, which is typically the word used for the main body, the central court. It's like the Supreme Court of the Jewish people. It was disbanded as a part of our exile process. It was eventually disbanded in Tiberias. We'll get back to that because recently people have tried to bring back a Sanhedrin. In modern day times, whenever they try to reconvene a Sanhedrin, where do they reconvene it? They go to modern day city in Tiberias. Why do they do that? Because the Rambam, when Maimonides writes about the disbanding of the Sanhedrin, we're not sure exactly what year it was, but it was a part of the exile process. Maimonides says our last Sanhedrin was in Tiberias, and then he cryptically writes, one day, when we reconvene this Sanhedrin in Messianic times, we're going to reconvene it in Tiberias, which is exactly why all modern-day efforts, which have always gone haywire to reconvene a Sanhedrin, always begin in Tiberias. Now, he sends out this letter and he reconvenes this Sanhedrin. What is he bringing the Jews together to discuss? It could have been a session at a JLI conference. He gave a list of questions that he wanted the rabbis to formulate answers to. On that list of questions are a list that you would get at any crossfire, any frequently asked questions. This was the most central question he wanted to know, and it's a question still on Jews' minds. What is the story with intermarriage? Are you allowed to marry non-Jews? Are you going to be a part of the same country, the same republic, the same empire as us? Are you going to be able to intermarry Jews and non-Jews, or only Jews can marry Jews? He wanted to know about the laws of divorce and marriage. Is this something that can only be transmitted and properly legally codified if it's overseen by a rabbi? Or is our state, the French state, are we going to be allowed to run divorces for the Jewish people? Now, in this group, I just want to make it very clear. So you could say, okay, he got a group of yokel rabbis together. They'll come up, they'll say anything. This was a group of the most esteemed rabbis in the world. The most esteemed rabbi at the time who participated in the Sanhedrin of Napoleon was somebody named Rav David Zinsheim. Rav David Zinsheim was a mentor of the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer. Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer, was one of the great legends, the great legendary personalities in all of Jewish history. The Chassam Sofer actually eulogized Rav David Zinsheim when he passed away. He was a colossal scholar. Colossal scholar. Now pause right now, and I want you to think for a moment. If the leader of the entire world, Napoleon, was at the height of his powers, gathered a bunch of us Jews together in a room and posed these questions to you, why not just lie? They could have coordinated with each other. They all undoubtedly spoke Yiddish, which Napoleon was not a Yiddish speaker. They could have, right? Napoleon was not a Yiddish speaker. And they could have conversed on their own. What would have been the problem? What would have been the problem of outright lying in that room? Now, this is a very, very important question, and I want to introduce a concept that is so crucial and has been debated throughout history. I'm going to use the Hebrew term, and then, of course, I will translate. And that Hebrew term is a term called Ziyuf HaTorah. Ziyuf HaTorah. What is Ziyuf? Ziyuf means a counterfeit. Ziyuf means when you pervert or counterfeit an idea. Ziyuf HaTorah. Where does this concept originate from? We have to rewind. Before the Sanhedrin in 1806, in the 16th century, there was an incredible scholar named the Maharshal, Reb Shlomo Luria. He was a cousin of Rav Moshe Isserlis, who wrote the glosses on the Shulchan Aruch. And the Maharshal, in his comments on Bava Kama, says something absolutely wild. Those of you may know the number one translation of the Torah is the translation of the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the translation of the Torah into Greek. It was under the reign of King Ptolemy HaMelech, Ptolemy. I think the P is silent when it's transliterated into English. And he brought together also a Sanhedrin of his own. He brought together a Sanhedrin of 70 rabbis together, and he said, I want you to render the Torah into Greek. The rabbis were a little bit nervous. Now, we have two histories of this story. We have one history of this story from the Talmud, and we have another history, not necessarily as accurate, but from Greek history, the letter to Aristas. And in this letter, it has the entire story of how these translators approached the Talmud. They approached the translation of the Torah. It was absolutely fascinating. It has their daily schedule. It says that to ingratiate themselves, they were working with Greek translators. They sent gifts to the Beis Hamikdash. There was still a Beis Hamikdash in this time. The temple in Jerusalem was still standing. They sent gifts to the temple. And they brought these rabbis together to translate the Torah. Now, the way the Talmud says it is that they put all the rabbis in 70 different rooms. They put them all in different rooms because they didn't want them to coordinate with one another. They didn't want them to read each other. What are you guys translating? They didn't want them to coordinate. They wanted them to be as honest and as real as possible. So they put them all in different rooms so they couldn't coordinate with each other. And they're each translating the Torah. And they get to a couple verses that are really, really tricky. They got to a couple verses, similar verses that Napoleon was interested about. Questions about intermarriage, questions about the distinction between Jews and non-Jews, and they start to get concerned. So a special miracle took place, and all of the translations came out, and it got accepted. They didn't get into any trouble. The Maharshal asks on this story, why not lie? Why not lie? You have a Greek king who could absolutely destroy the Jewish people. He could kill these rabbis in an instant. The Maharshal, 15th century, in 16th century, he wants to know, why not just lie? Why did they tell the truth? Why tell the truth in a translation? You could just skirt around it. So the Maharshal invents a concept. I don't know if he invented it, but he's certainly the one who popularizes it, which is an absolutely crucial concept to understand throughout Jewish history, and that is the concept of Ziyuf HaTorah. And the Maharshal says something absolutely jaw-dropping. The Maharshal writes that one must give up their life. It is Yehareg va'al ya'avor. You need to give up your life rather than violate the prohibition of counterfeiting the Torah itself. They were not allowed to lie on this, even though undoubtedly their lives were at stake. Even though undoubtedly they knew if this Septuagint came out offensive, they would have been killed. The Maharshal writes this principle. He says, to actually pervert the concepts in the Torah, you need to give up your life in order to avoid doing so. Why on earth is that such a central principle? Why on earth is that so central? Okay, you lied a little bit. Okay, you got out of it, but at least I'm alive to do it. Where would the notion of counterfeiting the Torah be tantamount to murder, adultery, idolatry? What are we talking about here? So this was a question that not so many people dealt with to really understand the philosophy of why counterfeiting the ideas in the Torah would actually be tantamount, that you have to give up your life rather than to counterfeit and pervert the words of the Torah. There's one person who we already mentioned, and this is our tour through all of history, because censorship, as we will see, is part of the formulation of Torah itself. And that person is Rav Yitzchak Hutner. Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Chaim, Berlin, he was actually quite close with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He has correspondence with the Lubavitcher Rebbe that are absolutely fascinating, where when the Lubavitcher Rebbe had the program, what's called the Mivtza, of putting on tefillin of people all around, Rav Hutner wrote him a little bit provocatively, because at an Aguda convention, somebody got up and said, this is ridiculous. The Chabad's going around and just slapping tefillin on whatever guy walks by in the street. This is absurd. There's no reason to do it. The Rebbe didn't feel it was necessary to respond, but Rav Hutner, who had a relationship with the Rebbe, was a little bit embarrassed. He said he was at that Aguda convention, and he reached out to the Rebbe and said, I want you to know, I was not the person who made fun of this program of putting on tefillin, but once we're in dialogue, I'll be honest with you, I'm not quite sure why it's anything, because the people who you slap tefillin on, and you're just kind of like rushing, you put on the rosh and the arms and you run away and the whole thing, they have no idea what they're doing. Is that really a mitzvah if they have no idea what they're doing? Does that really count for anything? And this correspondence, which is, again, jaw-dropping and gets to the heart of the brilliance of the Rebbe. The Rebbe's response, half of it was, for me at least, hilarious, and half of it was such brilliant scholarship. I'm just going to share with you the hilarious part. The Lubavitcher Rebbe looked at Rav Hutner and said, let's be honest for 1 second. You're telling me they don't know what's in here. Honestly, you think the average observant Jew, they know everything about tefillin? And what, if we tell them that this is phylacteries, does that clarify anything? He literally writes out the word in here, phylacteries. That's the translation of the word tefillin. We have a handful of words that in translation, they're actually more confusing than the original. All of a sudden, tefillin, let me explain this to you. You come to a Jew, you see they don't have a great Jewish education, you're trying to reach out to them, you say, these are phylacteries, as if phylacteries, now I understand. What are you talking about? Nobody knows what phylacteries are. It's like when we translate the Mishka, we call it the tabernacle. Well, people don't know what a tabernacle is. What are we doing here? Sometimes the original is easier to understand than the translation. The Rebbe says, okay, they know what tefillin are. As much as they know what phylacteries are, they could put them on. And he really mastered what Rav Hutner's questions were. Now, Rav Hutner, who had this relationship in 1970, there was an absolutely haunting experience. Rav Hutner was on an airplane. It's called Black September. He was on an airplane. He was traveling back to the United States. He was living both in Israel and in the United States of America. And he was traveling from Israel to get back to America. And he was going to be in America. He was actually going to be Masadar Kedushin to officiate the wedding of my brother-in-law's parents, the Bachkos. And he was going to be in Chaim, Berlin for Yontif. And he was on the plane, and all of a sudden on the plane, a Palestinian Liberation Front came up, and they hijacked the plane. Rav Hutner is sitting. Rav Hutner was one of the most senior rabbis. Everybody knew who Rav Hutner, he was world famous. Sitting right behind him was his daughter, Bruria David Hutner of blessed memory, next to her husband, Rav Yonason David, I believe. And they had their student, Reb Yankel Drillman, who is still alive and a Rebbe in Brooklyn in the yeshiva called Beis Yosef. And the Palestinian terrorists were so excited. They were thrilled. They said, we got a winner here. We captured one of the most famous Rosh Yeshiva in the entire world. And Rav Hutner is sitting there. He's wearing his overcoat. And the first thing that they do is they go up and down the lanes and they start collecting passports. Why? Because they want to see who are the Israeli citizens. And they're going up and down collecting the passports. And Reb Yankel Drillman, this is a true story, it's really, really wild. Reb Yankel Drillman, on the spot, there was a woman sitting next to him who said, I have two passports. I have an Israeli passport and a non-Israeli passport. What am I going to do? Reb Yankel said, give me your Israeli passport. He took the passport, true story, and he ate it. He put it in his mouth, he chewed it up and ate it. I always say, what do I look for in a rabbi? I want a rabbi who in a moment's notice can eat my passport. That's what I'm looking for. You know what I'm saying? Through the lamination, just really swallow, chew it down. We're used to it. We have 3 days old cholent. We can eat a passport. This is what the Jewish people do. This is what we do. The terrorists look at Rav Hutner, and we're going to come back, I promise you, to censorship. The terrorists look at Rav Hutner, and they realize they have a star. And they start treating him differently. They go up to Rav Hutner. This is all true, all in the memoirs that his daughter put out. And they ask, and there was a contemporary one called Terror in Black September by by David Rabb. You could find that. It's a beautiful book, and it has all of the details of this story. They come up to Rav Hutner, and they look at him, and they say, "Can we get you a drink? Can we get you a drink?" And Rav Hutner says, "Sure, I'd like a Pepsi. I'd like a Pepsi." They come. They give him a cup of Pepsi. He looks at the cup, looks back at the terrorists, hands them back the cup and says, "With ice, please. With ice, please." That's a Rosh Yeshiva. That's somebody who's fearless. Hands it back. "I'd like with ice." Now, Rav Hutner, this story is absolutely wild, where they took the planes back to Jordan. A civil war broke out in Jordan. Rav Hutner was in captivity for quite a long time. They actually got released. They got released not into American or Israeli hands. They had to walk alone through Jordan, waving a white flag to make sure nobody would think that they are part of this Jordanian civil war. They got released, and they're just in the middle of Jordan. They're not sure what to do. They're waving a white flag. Rav Hutner finally gets back. He gets back right in time before Rosh Hashanah, I believe. And they ask Rav Hutner in his memoirs, what were you thinking about? You were in captivity this entire time by terrorists, by people who are trying to destroy the Jewish people based on our cosmic biblical relationship. They know what they're doing, and we know, somebody like Rav Hutner understands why he's being persecuted. what were you thinking about? And Rav Hutner said, I was thinking about a Maharshal in Bava Kama. I spent my entire time in captivity thinking about this notion, this idea of counterfeiting the Torah, of why is it, according to the Maharshal, that to pervert the words of the Torah, you have to be willing to give up your life. This was the idea he was thinking about his entire time in captivity. What was the idea? Why did Rav Hutner say that the Marshal is so strict about perverting the ideas of Torah? He says something absolutely amazing. He says, the Torah is not a text. The Torah is not something that is standing on a piece of paper that is like set in stone that we can have over here. The Torah is the very formulation of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are the expression of Torah. Like the famous words of the Zohar of Yisroel Kutshabrichu v'Oraisa Chadhu. The Jewish people, the Torah, and God are all a part of the same manifestation of divinity. And when we pervert the Torah, you are perverting the very existence of the Jewish people, which is why our relationship to Torah needs to be with a reverence, with a seriousness, because to cross out a line is not just crossing out a line in a book. To cross out a line is to pervert the very nature and the very wholeness of the Jewish people, because these are the words that we have been carrying and articulating. The very word Yisroel, the Zohar, I believe in Rus, says that Yisroel is an acronym for Yesh Shishim Ribuyim Osios La Torah. There are 600,000 words in the Torah because Yisroel, the Jewish people, every Jew is represented correspondingly by a letter in the Torah. Now, I don't know if there are any mathematicians in the crowd or anybody who has enough time, but if you actually count up the letters in the Torah, you will notice it doesn't take a major genius to figure this out. There are actually not 600,000 letters in the Torah. There are 300,000 letters in the Torah. It's exactly half. And the Pnei Yoshua, Rav Yoshua Falk, actually asked this question in Kiddushin on page 30a in a little itty-bitty footnote at the bottom of the page. He says, wait a second. I thought the Jewish people are the manifestation of Torah, 600,000 letters of the Torah and 600,000 Jewish souls that form the collective body of the Jewish people, but there are only 300,000 letters in Torah. And he says, no, you don't understand. When we count, we don't just count the words on the page. We count the words that are expressed through the mouths of the Jewish people. When we utter a word of Torah, you have the letter, and then we have our expression of the letter. The way that we take that letter and apply it to our own lives. And that is how you get to that notion of 600,000, that the 600,000 letters of the Torah correspond to the 600,000 collective body of Knesset Yisroel, because every letter also needs to exist not only on the page, but in our hearts, in our minds, in our very identity and sense of self. When we think of censorship, we usually go to Napoleon's Sanhedrin, and they answered the questions very diplomatically. They did not lie, but they also did not press the gas. They explained how, yes, if a Jew and a non-Jew get married according to French law, it is recognized by French law. It is not something that the Jewish people encourage in Jewish law, but we would recognize that there is a marriage and they would require a civil divorce. They answered the questions very, very diplomatically. Now, I think there is an even more important aspect to censorship that we need to talk about, and it is not the censorship that comes from the top, from an enemy, from somebody who's trying to persecute or trying to gain control of the Jewish people, but the most important type of censorship actually comes from our friends. And those could be friends who are fellow Jewish scholars. It could even be your teacher, or it could be censorship from a friendly censor. What do you mean a friendly censor? I thought all the censors wanted to kill the Jewish people. Absolutely not. There is a censor, and you can look this person up. His name was Carl Fisher. Carl Fisher was a close friend of the Jewish people, and he was the censor. Who worked closely in the 18th century into the 19th century with somebody named Rav Eliezer Fleckless. Rav Eliezer Fleckless was the number one student of the Nodeh B'Yehuda, Rav Ezekiel, Rav Yecheskel Landau. And he had a close friendship with the local censor named Carl Fisher. They were super close. They would send letters to each other. Now, the major issue of censorship in this time and in all of Jewish history, the most censored aspect of Jewish law, this is so important to understand, is the aspect of the laws of conversion, the laws of gerus. The laws of gerus for most of Jewish history were deeply censored. How were they censored? You could open up most of an early work of Shulchan Aruch or even a contemporary work, a code of law known as the Aruch HaShulchan. When they introduced the laws of conversion, on the top of the page it will say, these are laws that no longer apply nowadays. What? No converts? I thought Jews welcome the converts. We have so many prohibitions and specific commandments about treating converts nicely, decently, giving them dignity, loving them. It's illegal to convert somebody? The answer is yes. For most of European history, it was absolutely illegal by the Christian government to convert non-Jews. So for most of the time, all of the books were censored, were literally in the laws of conversion. They would write, these are not laws that apply anymore nowadays. This became a major, major problem and actually related to Jewish law itself, because when all of the conversion issues came up in modern times, in contemporary times, in the free world, in the United States of America, there was a very, very small body of literature that actually discussed what are the laws of conversion. Very, very few. You could really count them out. How many responsa do we have through European history that deal with the actual rites of conversion? Where are they? Where did they go? They went because it was illegal. So Jews said, we're not going to convert anybody. We don't want anybody to get killed. There's a way to be a very decent, God-fearing person without having to join the Jewish people. We're not going to proselytize. And still to this day, on a lot of works, the censor has it on top over there. It says, these are laws that no longer apply nowadays. Now, obviously, in the United States of America, we do allow for conversion. But there were, because it was so illegal and it was so difficult, there were rabbis who wouldn't teach Torah to non-Jews because they were worried that, look, I'm going to teach you Torah. I know you want to be a Jew, but when it comes time to convert, the government's going to put a stop to this. So I'm not going to be able to teach you Torah because it's not a sure thing. Nowadays, it's so much easier to convert, so we're much more comfortable about teaching Torah to a sincere convert. But the very laws got changed because of the government issues. Now, I want to get to what I think is the most important type of censorship. And that is self-censorship in the way that we understand and the way that we develop our own Torah. Censors were not just people like Napoleon who were trying to antagonize us. They were not always our friends like Carl Fisher. And if you look at the introduction to Rev Eliezer Fleckless's responsa, he has a wonderfully titled responsa called Teshuva Me'ahava. Teshuva Me'ahava means repenting with love, where the entire introduction to the responsa is him responding and explaining all of the differences between Jews and non-Jews. What's that introduction doing to a beginning of a responsa literature? This was a letter that he wrote to Carl Fisher to explain to him how we understand non-Jews, how we understand the differences, how we understand the laws that might differentiate between a Jew who damages something versus a non-Jew who damages something. He explained all of this to his friend because he knew it wasn't antagonistic. He knew he wasn't going to get in trouble. There is the last most important type of censorship, and that is self-censorship. Now, why is this so important? Gets to the heart of censorship. I want to come back before Napoleon, before the Maharshal and Reb Shlomo Luria and Ziv HaTorah. I want to start from the first vision of a Mashiach, the first vision of a Redeemer. The first vision of a Redeemer. How do you know that we even going to have a Mashiach? Where do we get this from? How do we have this idea that we, the Jewish people, are going to be redeemed by a Mashiach? So the Rambam writes explicitly, the first time that we have a prophecy that relates to a Mashiach, the Rambam writes in the laws of, in Hilchos Melachim, in the very, very end, the final two chapters, the Rambam writes, Maimonides, that the prophecy of a Messiah begins with Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet. that Bilam is looking at the Jewish people, ready to curse them, and instead of cursing the Jewish people, this non-Jewish prophet says, "Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov," it's so beautiful the way that you sit separately and that your tents are so dignified, are so sensitive to one another, to your neighbors, and you're able to sit alone and preserve your identity. And then Bilam prophesies, derech kochav miYaakov, you're going to have a star that is going to redeem the Jewish people. This gets to the heart of what censorship is all about. Why is it that our vision of Mashiach comes from a non-Jew? Why is it that the first prophecy about a Mashiach, about a redemption, comes from a non-Jew? The answer lies in that the ultimate expression of Torah, the ultimate realization of what Torah is when we have an articulation of the experience of Torah, the experience that we all know if you relate to Torah, but we're able to transmit that experience through words, to translate that experience through words, and the entire world will look at our Torah and say, wow. That is unbelievable. The Messianic age and the idea of a Mashiach is the idea that not that just we realize that we have a Mashiach, but it's actually the non-Jewish world looks at us and says, do you realize what you have? Do you realize how beautiful it is that you're able to be preserved of how Torah and Shabbos and mitzvos have preserved the Jewish soul and the Jewish identity through centuries? Very often we don't realize what we have until we interact with somebody who is bereft without it. But Bilam is able to look at the Jewish people, comes to curse them, and all he's able to say is blessings. This is the ultimate expression, the Messianic Torah. A Torah that not only are we not embarrassed by, but a Torah that we are so proud of that it's the very reason why the non-Jewish world wants to talk to us. Like that apocryphal story of Napoleon going in on Tisha B'Av and asking, how is it that you're still doing this? And it reminds us, wow, look at what we have. Maybe this is real. Maybe this is real. Maybe for one moment we could close our eyes and think for a moment there is a God in the world and the Torah that we have and the practices we have, and Judaism is real. And very often we're not able to have that type of certainty until we see it from the outside, which is why every messianic redemption always involves by reaching from the outside and pulling in. The whole notion of Mashiach comes from the descendants of Rus. Rus was a convert, came from the outside and came in. This is what censorship allows us, because it is the dialogue that we have with modernity and the rest of the world that forces us to articulate a vision of Torah that can reach beyond our community. A vision of Torah that is so real, that can be articulated and expressed in such a sublime, uplifting way. A Torah that is such an expression of what the Jewish people are coming to perpetuate, that the non-Jewish world, the entire world looks, what is your secret? What is preserving you? And we're able to take that moment and say, you want to know what's preserving us? In this interaction, in everything that modernity has brought us, to have to be able to find the right words and the right language to express our identity, to express who we are, the answer is the Torah. The Torah is what is preserving us, and it is our interactions with the outside that allow us the perspective and give us the language to realize that the preservation of Torah is ultimately the preservation of the Yeshishim Ribuyim Osios La Torah, the preservation of the very identity, the very mystery, the very purpose of the Jewish people. Thank you all so much.
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.